Hikers and backpackers of Reddit. What is the weirdest or creepiest thing you have found while hiking? A few summers ago I was canoeing in the Boundary Waters with some friends. A few days into our trip, at least 2 days of paddling from the nearest entry point, we found the creepiest campsite on an island. There was brand new, abandoned camping equipment everywhere, like a sleeping bag and camping pad. Throughout the campsite, sticks with the ends charred had been stuck in the ground. In the remains of the fire was a heavily charred toothbrush, along with the remains of a wallet, glasses, papers and some clothes. The creepiest part was near the edge, where a single petrified moose altar had been wedged between some boulders and surrounded by charred sticks in a circle. We got the hell out of there and as far away as we could before night. One of the creepiest things I've ever seen, it looked straight out of a horror movie. A few years ago I was backpacking in Eastern Washington with some friends of mine. I don't know how well you guys know Eastern Washington, but it's pretty much dust, sagebrush and dirt. We decided to hike up onto the top of this canyon, and from up there you could see miles and miles of straight nothing. After a few hours of traversing the top of the cliff, we eventually found a little crevasse that kind of took us a little ways underground, into a pretty decent sized cave. The cave was filled with little bones, like mice and bats. In one of the corners of the cave, there was a rock fixture that jutted up from the ground and almost made a separate room, so to speak. In the room we found lots of scratches on the walls, photographs, and 3 bottles with notes in them. While this was kind of off-putting on its own, we figured it was just some sort of joke and we'd find silly SOS notes in the bottles. The scariest part about it all was the photographs were super ordinary, of families and normal people, and 2 of the notes in the bottles made no sense at all. While it was English, it was pretty much straight gibberish, none of the words made sense in context with the other words. The 3rd bottle had a super ordinary letter talking about what they've been up to, something you'd send to a fairly distant relative after not talking with them for a while. I don't really know what to think of it all. I feel like it could easily have been someone just joking around, but it was almost too strange for that. Edit, for all the people who are asking where it was, I'm fairly certain it was at a place called Dusty Lakes. I did a solo bike tour across the US, so I wasn't exactly hiking. I was in eastern Kansas, pretty close to the Missouri border, and I spotted a park in a town that looked pretty secluded, so I decided to camp out there for the night. I started wheeling my bike over to the gazebo where I was gonna stay, when this dude pulls up in a beat-up Ford Taurus. He gets out and comes over to me, asking if I had any money, telling me how his girlfriend ruined his credit and was now with another man. He said he was trying to make his way back to South Dakota. I got a really weird vibe from the dude. He kinda seemed like some sort of junkie. He asked me where I was headed, and he offered to drive me if I would pay for gas. I explained what I was doing, and that it kinda defeated the purpose. He looked dumbfounded, got back in his car and sped off through the park. I camped out there, and the next morning when I got up, his car was there, and he was just looking at me. I didn't even have breakfast, I just got the fuck out of there. TL, Dr. Creepy Dude states at me for God knows how long while I slept in a public park. I once found a man who had hanged himself. I was riding my bicycle on a path at night and my light shone directly on him hanging from a train bridge with his feet maybe 6 inches off the ground. Skip forward a few years and I am hiking in Patagonia with another traveler I met. The trails were not well marked so we kept getting lost. We were trying to find our way through some brush as I was telling him the story of finding the hanged man. Towards the end of my story, my friend says, "Look, a pile of bones." Pretty freaked out at first, thought maybe they were human. Upon closer inspection, we saw 2 spines and a bunch of rib bones of a human, chilling deer. No heads at first. They are endangered so we wondered if maybe some poachers took the heads or if it was a mountain lion food cache. We poked around some more and found the skulls. The antlers were locked together and it looked like they died that way. We tried to pull the antlers apart but they were impossibly stuck. In the end, we strapped them to my pack and I brought them back to this tiny town called Cerro Castillo. I gave them to this old woman who ran the hostel. Would have loved to keep them, but the humal is a national symbol and I didn't think I'd be able to get the skulls out of the country. The lady was ecstatic. She let me stay for free and tried to give me $40 when I was leaving. I have a picture of them somewhere. Not my story but a friend's. He doesn't use Reddit, so I'll share. He was with his wife hiking on a trail somewhere in Vancouver. He noticed a tree stump that had a plastic bag sitting on top of it. His curiosity got the best of him because it seemed to be filled with something. He approached it and noticed drops of blood around the bag. At this point he was worried that he would find a dead baby or a decapitated head. His wife kept urging him to ignore it, but he really wanted to see what was inside. He grabbed a stick and prodded it slowly, opening the bag to reveal a bloody rag. He unraveled the rag with the stick to discover a giant bloody dildo, with a note attached saying "Play with me." How about maybe a dead body rolled up in carpet in the middle of the desert? Found this out rock hunting with my dad near Wendover, UT/NV. The first time I looked from a distance and decided it was just an old carpet. A few months later I got closer and took the picture, but also decided it was probably just carpet. Probably. Because, well, what if the body had decayed to mostly bones? It would be hard to tell from 20 yards away. So the third time my mother was along and she was certain it was a dead body. I kicked it and it felt like carpet. The next damned year I drove my ass 3 hours out there to unroll the damned thing and prove it was just carpet. And guess what? It was the ugliest shag carpet I've ever seen. This happened to me back in the 80s, when I was in my 20s. On occasion I would go car camping with my yellow tiger cat, Oberon. He had an overbite, drooled, had a monster purr, and was awesome in every way. He loved riding in the car. My solo camping was stupid, and I cannot recommend it, but I needed the aloneness and I needed the bravery. I would drive up roads, some BLM, some national forest, some disused logging roads. I would not go too far, find a spot that appealed to me, pull off the road as far as I could, set up a small camp and stay for a night or two, just reading, bird watching, painting, being with my cat, just spending time being me. One day I went up a road, and found a pretty meadow, with a small stream curving around through trees, a perfect place. The cat and I walked around a bit, checking it out. At the side of the meadow near the road was a large flat, round rock. A perfect table. I always packed good food, and I liked a bit of elegance. I set out a placemat, cloth napkin, an unopened bottle of dark beer, my sandwich, still wrapped in foil, on my plate, cookies, and a bowl of kibble for Oberon. He had wandered a bit, and I went to get him. We went into the trees, and wandered around for a bit. It was a very lovely day, warm, sunny, with a light breeze, and the whole area was beautiful. We were not out of sight of my car, and the rock for very long, maybe 15 minutes. I picked up the cat, and walked back, looking forward to lunch. When we got to the rock it was gone. Eaten. The foil was crumpled into a ball, the beer was empty, with the opener next to the bottle, cookies gone, sandwich gone, napkin folded loosely, and knife laid across the plate. It was an oh shit feeling. I ran for the car, tossed Oberon in, started the car, turned around, headed back down the hill. Then I thought, what if whoever ate my food was hiding in my back seat? I stopped, heart pounding, checked out the back, all okay, and headed back to town and friends, who were understandably freaked out by my story. I still camped after that, but it took a while for my courage to return. I had the opposite happen to me. I've had guns held on me, been in car wrecks, got stuck out in the mountains with a dislocated knee in winter. This is easily the most frightened I've ever been, which is weird, because I didn't have any real reason to be scared. Deep woods, Vermont, maybe 11 at night. I'm in my hammock, just sort of chilling. I'm reading by headlamp, when I hear a noise. I kill my lamp and listen. Sounds like something's moving around maybe 100 yards away. I squeeze my eyes shut. I have pretty good night eyes, but I'd just been reading so I couldn't see much, and listened. I didn't hear anything else, but I was uneasy. I slid out of my hammock and snuck over. There's a large flat rock, just like yours, with two stumps on either side, like chairs. Laid out on the rock was dinner for one. Plate, flatware, a big-ass sandwich, and a dark brown bottle. I was confused, and a little creeped out, but not unduly scared. I reached out for the bottle, not to drink it, just curious, and when I picked it up, it was ice cold. This was the middle of summer, there was no way it had been sitting out for more than 20 minutes. As soon as I realized that, I got that horrible ripple down your spine, and the feeling of eyes on the back of my neck. I put the bottle down real slow, and put my hand on my pistol. I always carry a .45 in the woods. I looked around, and didn't see anything, but I still felt like somebody was eyeballing me. I walked back to camp, and my head was spinning like a top. I was ready to fucking piss myself. I made it back to camp, haha, but I still had that feeling. If anything, it was worse. It reminded me of all the times I had to go down into my grandpa's basement as a kid, and walk past his old stuffed deer head. That feeling of terror, and the knowledge that if I ran, it was going to get me. It was just like that. I was scared out of my mind, but by the time I got back to camp I was sure that if I ran, something was going to pounce out of the trees. I left all my shit, and walked maybe another 20 yards through the trees to one of the craggy mini cliffs you get out there, white-knuckling my pistol as those shivers rippled from the back of my neck to my spine. Every horror movie I'd ever read, every scary story I'd ever told, it was all bouncing around my head. I put my back to the rock and I fucking stayed there. I had that feeling of being watched by something that had no love for me until about 3 in the morning. When the sun came up, I packed my shit and booked it. Didn't go back to the table, just got my gear and hoofed it out as quick as I could. I had to sleep another night in the woods before I was out, and while I didn't feel anything, I still hardly slept a wink. Now, I'm fairly certain there was some kind of explanation for the food, and I'm sure the feeling I got was me scaring myself. I've always had an active imagination for that sort of thing. That said, while I still love to camp in the Green Mountain State, I haven't been within 50 miles of that spot again, and I still have nightmares about it sometimes. In junior high my family drove halfway across the country for a family reunion. We went for a long, boring hike. When we reached the end of the hike I decided to take off running down the mountain by myself. By the time I got to the bottom I was dehydrated and exhausted. This couple in their 40s saw I wasn't doing good and called an ambulance. The EMTs told my mom I could have died had those people not called 911. I remember wanting to thank the people who helped me but they were long gone. Flash forward to my senior year in high school. I'm taking World Lit. With a new teacher. Teacher walks in the room. You saved my life 6 years ago at Yellowstone Park. I took him a few seconds but he remembered the whole thing. This happened while I was backpacking in the Goat Rocks Wilderness in Washington State. My friend and I were trying to get up into a certain basin above the tree line, and we got a really late start thanks to road construction, so we were really hoofing it up the trail trying to make camp before dark. My friend hikes way faster than I do, so he got way out ahead of me by the time I got to where our detour from the main trail up an informal boot path would take us up into the basin he was nowhere to be seen. So, there being no campsites near where I stopped, I backtracked for about 3/4 of a mile to a lake where there were established campsites right along the trail. After maybe an hour my friend shows up having realized his mistake. This is well after dark, and we settled in not really knowing our surroundings. It was a fairly large open area though, likely a horse camp area because the trail is popular with horse packers, but we encountered none, set up our tents, both one person, ate and went to bed. Neither of us usually sleep well when backpacking, but for whatever reason he was out cold and I was sort of lucid at best for quite a while. just listening to the sounds of nature and trying not to psych myself out about the possible demons and monsters and man-eating beasts lurking in the woods every time I heard a twig snap or a pine cone fall from a tree. So maybe 3 or so hours after I went to bed, this would have been maybe 1 AM, I start hearing a very distinct sound of really heavy footsteps around my camp area, maybe as much as 100 feet away. I didn't really think to analyze the patterns the footsteps made at the time, but I remember it sounding distinctly bipedal. You can usually pick out a deer or mountain goat because they don't plant their feet in pairs. Other than these occasional footsteps, it's basically dead silent, no crickets or rustling of bushes or anything. That silence was instantly shattered by the most terrifying sound I have ever heard in my life. It was basically the same intensity as a whistle on a steam train, but much, much deeper and more demonic-like. Almost like a cross between a cow mooing and a lion's roar, but loud enough that it echoed off the mountains on the opposite side of the valley. Immediately after this noise, this creature went hauling ass off into the woods, crashing through the bushes. The forest I could see when I set up camp was basically covered in head-high huckleberry shrubs, but remained running around in earshot for at least 2 minutes, running back and forth, sometimes getting distinctly closer, sometimes getting further away. All this time it sounded like it was a creature with 2 legs running around. This whole time my heart was doing about 200 BPM and I was sure I was going to be eaten by a chupacabra or something. After a couple minutes the footsteps faded and it fell silent again, and I never heard anything else. I probably lay awake for at least another hour before I finally fell asleep. My friend didn't heard a damn thing. In the morning when I woke up, I looked around and there was a wide open area that led down to a small beach at the nearby lake to see if there was any evidence of what the noise was. Turns out there were fresh elk prints in the mud near the lake, and maybe 20 to 30 feet away was a large print of either a cougar or a bear, I don't remember which. So likely something was stalking one of the elk that wandered near my camp and spooked it in the middle of the night and caused it to spaz the fuck out. At least that's what I hope it was. TL, Doctor, cougar or bear spooked a possessed elk which made demon sounds in the middle of the night maybe 100 feet from my tent. This must have been around 1992. I was camping and hiking with a friend in the Lake District and we were making our way through Borrowdale along the Derwent. It's a popular spot of the country, there's always plenty of tourists out and about. I was following my friend and we rounded a large boulder by the river and he stopped. We did that comedy thing of me not paying attention and bumping into him. He indicates to me to shush and I poke my head around to see what made him stop. Stood in the middle of the river was a masturbating man, shirt pulled up and tucked under his chin, trousers nowhere to be seen. We sniggered, shook our heads and took a different route. He didn't see us. We ambled and dawdled further along the route and after a snack stop we could hear what sounded like girls squealing. We decided to investigate and who did we see but the masturbator once again with trousers around his ankles this time. Only this time he's flashing at girls on the other side of the river. Gripped by an adolescent sense of justice we decided something must be done, but being a pair of fairly weedy nerds we thought getting the police would be better. It was agreed my friend would jog up to the nearest road to flag down someone to call the police and I'd remain behind to keep an eye on Mr. Wavy Penis. I skulked unseen behind a tree and kept watch. After a couple of minutes something must have unnerved the wanker, I'm assuming an infuriated parent starting to wade across the river or something, as he left the riverbank and headed straight through the woods towards where I was hiding. I was sitting in a hollow in the roots of a tree. He walked straight past me and turned to look behind him. He was only feet away. I stopped breathing. He stared through the trees for what felt like an eternity. I thought I was doomed. Then he just turned away and headed back up to the road. I followed him to the road and figured out he was headed for the nearest car park. My friend had gone that way to find someone to call the police, so we met up as he was coming back to find me and we were able to get the registration of the van that Flashman had got into. Within a minute of him driving off, a police car arrived giving the full blues lights and squealing tires. We waved them down and they were there to respond to the call. My friend had convinced someone to make to 999 for us. We gave a brief description and the van details. The police were delighted as this guy had been doing this for years, but people would see him and run off to call the police. How did we ever cope before mobiles? And he'd have disappeared by the time they arrived. We arranged to make fuller statements at the station and started to drive back. Luckily we were parked in the same car park and the police would follow us back to Keswick. About halfway back along the valley I checked the rear view mirror and saw the police car slam on the brakes and throw on the lights. They disappeared down a track off the road. When we got to the station to make our statements, we were pulled into a side room and told to be quiet. The policeman told us they had spotted the van as we were driving back and had gone looking for him. They had found the flasher with his shirt off and flies undone prowling through the woods. Unfortunately there were no available cells in the station, small town, so he was being held in one of the offices next to where we were. Arrangements were made to return to take part in an identity parade and to point out our man. When we did return later, the police told us he had now refused to take part in an ID parade, so we were asked whether we would be prepared to be taken into the room he was being held in, look him in the eye and confirm it was the flasher. We agreed, fuck it, it's not like we had to live there, and confirmed that was the guy. Full statements were given, justice was done, and we would eventually receive a lovely letter from the Cumbrian top cop thanking us for our efforts. As we left the station feeling rather exhilarated after our small adventure, Mr. Wagglenob's wife, we assumed, arrived. Before the doors closed fully behind us we could hear her shouting, "You dirty fucker, you've fucking been doing it again, haven't you? TL, doctor, hiking, waggling penis, justice. All in one afternoon." I was mountain biking with my dad and a bunch of his friends, and we came to the last long downhill of the ride. I always let them go first, because I am way faster. They go down, and I wait for 5 minutes, then go for it. I get 200 yards from the end of the trail, and they are all on one side of the trail stopped in a line. At this point, there is no way I can stop fast enough, so I just get ready to jump anything in the way of the trail. My dad freaks the fuck out telling me to stop. 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 As soon as I get within 20 feet, I see probably 30 big ass rattlesnakes crossing the trail. I immediately pull up as hard as I can, and bunny hop about 10 feet over all of them. Then I stopped, came back, and checked out the snakes along with my dad's blood pressure, made sure he was okay, then finished the ride. I'm telling you, sickest bunny hop ever. One of my friends saw this guy while hiking in Japan. I went canoeing/camping with some friends on a river in Florida. We stop and eat lunch and we're messing around in the water when I see a pumpkin floating by. My first thought was to pick it up and chuck it at one of my buddies, so I waded over to it. When I touched it, the pumpkin rolled over and it had been hollowed out and someone had stuck a chicken in it. Not a cooked chicken, a real, feathers and all chicken. They had cut a hole in the top of the pumpkin and pulled the chicken's head through it, and its little chicken legs and tips of its wings were hanging out of the bottom. We figured it was some kind of Santeria thing maybe, either way it freaked me out. A few years ago, I was hiking somewhere on the border of Montana and Idaho, the exact location escapes me at the moment. I was with my uncle, and the hike was something like 6 miles in, 6 miles out from to a lake. Keep in mind, this is a very remote area. To even get to the was about a 20 to 30 mile drive in non-dirt/logging roads. There were no other cars at the and we didn't see anyone on the trail the entire day. On the hike in, we noticed a makeshift camp set up along the trail to our right. This was by no means a designated camping area. It just happened to be enough of a clearing to pitch a tent, and have a small area to walk around in. The camp looked somewhat disheveled, and there was nobody in immediate sight. We continued on to the lake, ate lunch, and headed home sometime later in the afternoon. On our way back, the camp was now to our left. Now that we were headed in the opposite direction, the camp came into view much sooner along the trail than it did on our hike in. It was a few minutes until we actually reached this camp. I had a very eerie feeling now. From this direction, I could now see that the tent flap was unzipped entirely. I found this strange, and scanned the camp for its residents. By the time we reached the camp, nobody had appeared, and I decided to yell out to anyone who may be in the camp. Maybe to say hello, maybe to see if anyone needed any help. I just had a strange feeling that something was wrong here. At this point, my uncle was very much freaked out and was trying to continue walking along without incident. I yelled out 3 or 4 times towards the camp, each time walking closer and closer to the tent. I got no response. I stood a few feet away from the tent, and scanned around the hills, and there was nobody in sight. The camp looked exactly the same as it did on our hike in. Upon further inspection I could see a few items strewn about the grounds beyond the tent. But my first stop was definitely going to be the tent. I thought for a few seconds and pondered exactly what I may find in the tent. I was scared of waking someone, but more scared of finding someone who may not be able to wake up. I crept closer, my uncle reluctantly following about 10 paces behind. I yelled a few more times. No answer. I push aside the flap, and there's nothing but a sleeping bag, laid out perfectly as if someone had just unrolled it. Keep in mind, this is a very nice tent. Perfectly assembled too. Nice vestibule, spacious, and sturdy. It struck me as odd that someone with such a nice tent would have been so foolish to have left their tent unzipped. So I stood, and scanned again. This tent was a few hundred feet away from a very small water source. There were various items, as I said earlier, every 50 feet or so. I noticed a Ziploc bag on the top of a boulder, right next to this stream. I headed over there and found that it contained several strips of uncooked bacon. Again, strange. My thoughts were racing and I had an overwhelming feeling that I was being watched. I put the bacon back where I found it and looked around again. Nobody was here. We hadn't seen anyone all day, and this camp looked exactly the same as it did in the morning. Who in their right mind would leave this bag of bacon sitting right here? Who would even bring bacon into a place like this? And how? There was no ice chest, not even a car at the TH. Why would you bring food like that into an area where there are mountain lion as well as bear? There wasn't even a stove, or any cooking utensils in sight. This was a very barren camp. My thoughts began to slow down and I looked to my feet. I saw several shell casings and several rounds to a .45 caliber handgun. This was the icing on the WTF cake. My uncle insisted we leave immediately, and at this point, I agreed. We hiked rather quickly out. Counting paces, I calculated that the makeshift camp was about 1 mile from the TH. I still have no idea what could have happened at that camp. Still freaks me out. But it makes for a very good story. When I was a venture scout, my crew and I went to New Mexico for a backpacking trip. On the 8th day in, 2 other guys and myself had to go fetch creek water that was 2 miles away, or so the map said. We've already hiked around 6 miles that day, so by the time we set out it was getting close to sundown. As we made our way to the creek, we came to a fork in the road and had to consult the map. The oldest of us was on watch duty in case any feral animal came upon us and we needed to hightail it out there. Well, while me and my other friend were figuring out which road to take, the watchman taps us on the shoulder and tells us to be quiet. We shut up and look to where he is pointing. It was, what I assumed to be, a mountain lion maybe 300 feet from us and 50 feet above us on the cliff. He was looking right at us. For whatever reason he never pounced or attacked us. He was just observing us. We carefully backed away from him, and once we thought we reached a safe distance we just calmly hiked away from all the while our hearts were pounding. In the end, we got the water after being observed by what we thought was a mountain lion. Scared poopless. A friend and I had some time to kill before heading to another friend's house for the night. We decided to take a stroll down a popular walking path in my town that runs through a field of tall, thick brush, so tall that you cannot see over it. So we're about 15 minutes into the walk when we decide that we've gone far enough, and it was time to turn around and walk back to our car. On the way back I noticed a large, dark green electrical box in the distance alongside the path, which was weird because there's nothing around to power. As we got closer, I said to my friend, I really don't remember that electrical box being there before. As soon as my friend said yeah that's weird, me either, I shit you not, the electrical box shot into the brush at instantaneous velocity, uninterrupted by any bushes or trees that may have been in the way. We both stopped in our tracks, and stood there speechless for a solid 60 seconds, looking forward with our jaws hanging open. We were both in such disbelief at what we just saw that we could not form a coherent thought. We eventually looked at each other and decided we had to keep walking anyway to get to the car, so we walked up to where the box was, and there was absolutely no sign of anything breaking into the brush. This thing easily would have broken a few bushes down or snapped a tree branch, as it looked exactly like a 4x5x5 large electrical box, and it was shot into the brush as if it was afraid of us. This is the weirdest thing that's ever happened to me, and it's not even a cool story to tell my other friends because it's about a haunted electrical box. But it was really scary at the time, and still is when I think about it. I don't walk there anymore. Not necessarily weird, but pretty intimidating because of what happened. I was leading the group of people I was hiking the it with. I really haul ass on ridges, so I had a pretty good pace going, faster than most people walk in a city rush. All of a sudden, I noticed that the root maybe 3 feet in front of me was not a root. It was a rattlesnake. I screeched to a halt. But Buddy behind me had no warning and bumped into me, sending me right towards it. To make matters worse, it was right next to a tree, so I glanced off of that. That's why I assumed it was a root. I sort of leapt over the snake, and everyone else stopped and then went around. It was fortunately docile before I leapt over it, and only moved after we were all past it, and the one dumbest got way too close with the camera and pissed it off. Pretty cool. I'll see if I can find a photo. TL, Doctor jumped, and almost got jumped by a rattlesnake. I'm super late, so this will be buried, but I was on a long road trip with a friend about 2 years ago when we stopped in an incredibly remote area. It was a huge forested area on the coast with a military base tucked away somewhere in there. My friend and I decided to go for a hike at about 9 p.m. It might seem like a stupid idea, but the area wasn't exactly mountainous. It was a pretty bright night and we were well geared, so if we got lost we could have easily waited out the night. We sort of forgot that it was Halloween until we were halfway through the hike, talking about how big the moon was. A 20-minute walk away from the empty car park, and approximately 20 to 30 minutes drive to civilization. As we walked we could hear thumping, but we disregarded it as kangaroos. It was scary at first, to hear something that big go racing past in a dark blur, but it happened so often we got used to it eventually. When we neared the coast we could hear the waves rolling in. We searched around for a way down to the beach when suddenly we heard something different. There was a steep descent on one side of the path, and we could hear something big climbing up it from the water. Branches were snapping and you could hear heavy breaths as it got further and further up. My friend turned to leave when we heard a man's voice say shakily hello. My friend looked at me and shook his head and backed away silently. I'm instinctively curious. Hello? I called back. Is that the path? Holy shit. Somebody had fallen off the path on the way to the beach. Yeah, we'll pull you up. Using a broken branch we pulled him up to the path. He stood up, thanked us and said, "Have you seen my friend?" No. I'm sure he'll be around. Thanks guys. And with that he walked off. We went to the beach, skipped some stones, and on the way back we saw him again standing on the path with another man. They were just standing there talking quietly. We passed, said good day and received a mumbled reply and walked on by. When we got to our car there was a 4WD parked not far away. There's no way we could have missed that, it was right in front of our headlights. Where did he come from and how did we pass his friend? How did they get split up? Who fucking knows? Not found but witnessed. I was doing my annual road trip through New Hampshire and Vermont, USA, during the prime week for fall foliage. This trip, I invited my dad with me, in order to get him out of the house and to try to help his depression. It had rained all day long, but we finally reached a scenic waterfall. Soon as the waterfall was visible, we saw a few other people. As I looked towards the top of the waterfall, I saw an elderly man had crossed beyond the wooden guardrails and was trying to take a closer picture with his little point-and-shoot camera. At this moment, he slipped and fell in. It was a three-tiered waterfall, Saturday Falls, gushing literally hundreds of gallons of water per second. I instantly screamed, "Dad, Dad, someone just fell in." At this moment, the guy's head barely bobbed up from the first tier, and he was facing my direction. His nearby family and my dad hadn't seen him slip, but my scream alerted them. The guy was no longer seen again. We frantically all spread out through the course of the waterfall, looking for signs of him for the next 20 minutes. It was almost magical how we all did this instantly and effectively without any communication, too much distance and too loud due to the falls for communication. Nobody could call the police due to no cell phone coverage in the area. Later we found out that his family did in fact see him at some point as he was being washed down. His body was found the next day by authorities. He was in his 60s. As a photographer and thrill seeker, I will always be cautious now. Super late to the party here, and this isn't exactly hiking, but here we go. I was driving with my buddy in the middle of the outback of Australia in a camper van that we were living out of for the past month. Now in the outback there are really long stretches of road that just go straight for kilometer after kilometer and a whole lot of nothing, and you can see for miles and miles. We were driving from Cobar to Broken Hill, and the thing about driving in the outback of Australia is that is the Wild West and is well known for serial killers, and I remember we came over one hill and just saw the strangest cloud formation on the horizon, and we just kept getting closer and closer to it. This was fun because when there isn't much to look at, and a giant black cloud during sunset was pretty sweet. So this cloud was forming out of nowhere and it kept getting bigger. Suddenly we could finally see that it was a huge fucking fire. I drove as fast my 1982 Toyota Hi-Ace could drive. Not that fast. All I could think was, oh crap, people are in trouble, people are in trouble. We get a bit closer and we realize it's not one fire but two. I pushed my van as hard as I dared. We finally get close enough to get a bit more of the picture, and it was two extremely large trees over 100 years old each, which makes no sense in the middle of the outback, and both were completely engulfed in flames. But this isn't even the weirdest part. As we approach, there is a station wagon in the ditch that runs alongside the road with its lights on and engine still running. By this point we had rolled up to the scene and noticed people in normal clothes standing and staring at the tree fires, while a man with I assumed was a Bible preached at them, very fire and brimstone-y. We pulled up in our van and they started walking towards us. Being completely freaked out by the scene we came upon, I floored it to the next town. We told people at the next town what we had seen, and they looked at us like we had three heads. Probably way too late, but this was a pretty good one. A few years back, I was about 12 at the time, 21 now, my family decided to take me and a bunch of my friends up hiking and camping at a spot we go to often by the river. However, a few months earlier, two women had been murdered, shot, on a different trail a few miles up the highway. So I was a little skeptical in my 12-year-old state of mind. But we went anyway. That night we camped on the rocky beach between the river and the woods. No one else was in the area, and all the cars we had seen had left before dark. At about 10 o'clock in the pitch black we began to hear chopping noises from the woods, very loud and really close. Our dogs started freaking out, and all my friends and my sister and I were pretty nervous. My dad, however, had balls of steel and decided to circle the area and enter the woods from the flank of where the noise was coming from to see what was up. I was very nervous and our dogs were continuing to bark. When he got into the woods, the chopping stopped and did not pick up again until he returned to our campfire. We left the next day and never found out what it was.
Sorrowful happiness that I just can't seem to guide.